All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, and I believe you just heard the recording has been started. So we plan to share this out with all of the participants afterwards so that you can take more notes, or if questions come up, those will always be available for you. And I'll also post that onto our PACES site too for those that were not able to attend. But thank you all for being here. I'm Trista Bergerud, the Assistant Director of Programming and Communications in the Graduate School. And then we also have AVP Pottinger with us.
Good morning, everyone.
And then our presenter today, Meghan Veltri from the Career Center. So Meghan has a great presentation for us on interviewing skills. So we'll let her get started. Please be sure to use the Q&A option at the bottom of the screen. And then I'll keep an eye on that and try to answer any questions that I can. And then we hope to have some time at the end, which we are ending at 12:45 today. So we hope to have some time at the end to go over any of those questions.
All right. Thank you very much, Trista.
Yeah, of
right.
course.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are enjoying your lunch and able to kind of relax as we go through this presentation. We're talking about interviewing today, which can feel, of course, a little bit formal and intimidating, but really I hope for this to be a space where you can get a lot of good information that you will need for interviewing, but then also please feel free to ask questions. You can type them in the chat. Trista's going to monitor that for us. So I told Trista she can ask at any point. I want to make sure that we get your questions answered for today. And then I'll be mindful of the time and keep you all on track, as I know that you're probably very busy and this is your lunch hour. So we appreciate you coming today. My name is Meghan Veltri, and I am one of the assistant directors at the Career Center. So I work specifically with health sciences. So I do work with health science graduate students. I myself am an alum from Grand Valley's Graduate School. So I graduated from the College Student Affairs Leadership Program in 2012, and I've been working at Grand Valley ever since. So we'll go ahead and get started with interviewing. And right now, I imagine some of you might be feeling this way. So you might be thinking, gosh, please hire me. If you're graduating this semester, you might be feeling that way, the loom and doom, and maybe not doom, right? But the loom of applying for jobs, it really is kind of its own job. The process of applying for jobs, right? You are searching for those positions on different websites. You're putting together your materials, you're putting yourself out there, and then there's that risk of you might get the job and you might not, and you might have to start that process over again. So we know it can be kind of draining and take a lot of energy. But once you get to that interview, the employer has said, hey, we're really interested in you, and we know that you're good candidates, and we want you to feel that way too. So the only thing is we'll need to communicate it a little bit more than hire me, I'm good at things, right? And so we know that you all are great. And so we'll talk a little bit just about the initial part of the job search process first, and then we'll transition straight to interviewing. So when it comes to job searching, like I said earlier, it might feel like another full-time job on top of your job of being a student and maybe having a family and your personal life and. So it really can feel like things are adding up. But we have resources here at the Career Center to help you. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was resumes and cover letters. Just so you know, we have our career lab, which you can attend at the Career Center. So we have drop-in hours every day from 11 to 4, where someone will help you with your resume and cover letter review. We also have virtual hours from 4 to 7. But you can also schedule appointments with your career advisor as well. So everybody all students have a career advisor, and so it's based on discipline. You don't need to know the name of your advisor if you wanted to schedule an appointment with our office. All you have to know is the area that you're in, and we'll get you set up with the appropriate advisor. As far as job searching, Handshake might be a tool that you have utilized in the past. So you can use that for on-campus and off-campus positions. Internships and practicums included can be on there. LinkedIn is a great tool that you can use for networking. It can help you to identify positions. You can see who's in your field. I always think LinkedIn is a great way to find kind of the celebrities in your field or people who are doing research. If you are exploring even graduate programs beyond the graduate experience at Grand Valley, maybe you're considering going on for your PhD, LinkedIn is a great way to do some of that research as well. And then something that students might start to do while they're looking for jobs is to work with recruiters, and you can reach out to recruiters through LinkedIn. If you need assistance with that or not really sure how to go about doing that, the Career Center can help you with that. But just know it's totally appropriate to reach out to a recruiter on LinkedIn. They are there to help you with that job search process. They work in the HR departments and will connect with their internal departments. So it's a great option for you. Job searching can be tricky, and the industry or the timeframes differ based on industries. So I would recommend that you consult with people in your industry to see when the time frame is. But often I'll have students who will say, oh, I'm just not seeing a lot of postings right now. And like recently, a lot of students said, well, I was looking over winter break and I didn't see much. And sometimes what happens is other people are also interested in winter break and the holidays, and things get a little bit delayed. And so the start of the year, you might see more postings now during this time frame. Of course, it depends on your industry, but I would say you do have to get, when you're job searching, check pretty frequently. So we, of course, you can consult with the Career Center if you have more questions about kind of getting through this part of job searching. But today we're going to focus on interviewing. And so I want to acknowledge that if you are interviewing, this might be your first big interview. And that could almost be for anybody in their career, right? Sometimes after grad school, that's when the first big position comes. Or it might be that you've worked in the industry or a different industry for a while and you've interviewed before, and maybe this is your first interview within your industry. Maybe you did a career change, or maybe you're a seasoned veteran at it, but still feeling a little bit nervous. And I always say nervousness is good. So nervousness just shows that you're taking things seriously, but we want you to be prepared. And so with interviewing, it is really important to prepare. And I'm talking more than just, oh, the night before I ran through some questions and I'm feeling pretty good. You definitely want to be doing your research on the employer. There's a lot of great places that you can do research. You can, of course, go to their websites. But as I mentioned earlier, LinkedIn would be another great resource to use. So LinkedIn usually has more of the human resources and more of the recruiting side of information about an organization, where the website is typically for the customer. So LinkedIn kind of gives you an insider look, but I also recommend, reading articles on the organization. If you see any of those posted, you can follow them on other social media platforms, and you might find some really great information too. So just try to be a wealth of information and take in everything. I should say, try to be a sponge of information and take in everything that you can about that organization, so you feel really well prepared going in. And you might be interviewing for a job or a career. It could be a program. Maybe you're considering something really specific, like a postdoc, and some students are considering other graduate school routes. So I know that everybody is looking at something different. Interviewing can really be kind of the same overall. So yes, there might be different types of interviewing, but the responses you might be formulating, that can kind of translate through disciplines and different modalities of interviewing. I'm going to focus on some of the main types of interviews that you hear pretty often. So these days, phone interviewing and virtual interviewing has become kind of the starting point for a lot of places, just because it does save employers money by not having to maybe fly people out for that first interview. So often what will happen is you will have a first time interview, which might be either done over the phone or virtual. So with a phone interviews can feel a little bit intimidating and tricky, just because sometimes they're very fast. You might feel like it was either quicker than you thought, or maybe you feel like after it, you might have blacked out, right? You're like, I don't even know what I said. And that can happen with phone interviewing. And someone once told me some really great advice about phone interviewing. After I'd done it, I said to a friend of mine, I was like, gosh, it felt so awkward. I just didn't know exactly what they were looking for. I went to stop, and she said, you have to remember, you're missing a lot of those visual cues. You don't get that in a phone interview. So things like nodding along, or where you feel like you're receiving a smile from the people that you're interviewing with, you just don't get that in a phone interview. And some people might seem a little bit warmer than others over the phone. So there's just a lot you're trying to navigate. So with phone interviews, I say, if it feels a little bit awkward, it's because it is awkward. And I would say that to all interviewing, but specifically phone interviewing, just because you don't get that kind of positive reinforcement from facial expressions. The next is virtual interviewing. Virtual interviewing, I think we're all a little bit more comfortable with being in front of screens, but that doesn't mean that that doesn't bring a different layer of maybe concern or worry that comes with interviewing virtually. Just because you're worried, you might be worried about technology, or you might be concerned that you're not as comfortable with maybe presenting virtually. So we're going to go over some tips with virtual interviews. In person is probably what we're most familiar with, is the in-person interview. And that sometimes I think can be great because you can get a feel for the space and place that you are at or that you might be working in the future. You can see some natural interactions between some of the people that are working there. You might be able to get that virtually on Zoom as well, but I think definitely in person, you can kind of take in the whole system that you might be working for in the future. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of other different types of interviews. You might have an individual interview, which is, kind of that traditional format, but there's also group interviewing. Group interviewing can be more common in graduate school, or for maybe very competitive programs. You might have a group interview where typically you might be on a panel. I think some grad programs like perhaps I think OT has done in the past, you might have been in a group interview. Sometimes medical schools do it too, where you have to complete a puzzle or something like that. So that's definitely a different style. You don't see that everywhere, but just kind of in specific spaces. And then multiple mini interviews. Some of you might be considering going on to medical school, and this is typically where you will see multiple mini interviews. This is a little bit of a round robin of interviews. It's usually timed. So you have maybe a 4-minute room, a 5-minute room, and a 6-minute room, and then they give you the question beforehand. You read what the scenario is, and then you walk into a room and then you answer from there. And then usually the interviewer doesn't say much. They just listen to everything you're saying. So there is some skill involved in that. I won't spend too much time on that, but I will tell you the Career Center can help you with that. And then also our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences Academic Advising Department, they do a great job of preparing students for that. So if that is something you're considering, just let us know. Or if you're considering medical school, you hear about an MMI, let us know, and we have resources that can help to support you. When you are preparing for the interview, you definitely want to be very thorough with the preparation that you do beforehand. So you want to read the job description. You want to research the company. So you want to make sure that you have a very good understanding of the job description. You want to do that company research beforehand. You have to be a bit self-aware of what your mannerisms are too and how you're communicating. This is where simulated interviews or practicing interviewing with somebody else can be really helpful. Our office provides simulated interviews, so we do those in person and virtually, so you can take advantage of that as a graduate student at Grand Valley. But also talking with people in your industry can be really helpful as well too. You want to know the details, so you want to know who you're meeting with. So if you receive an invitation to interview, usually that information will be included in there. But if you don't know, if they didn't include that, it is perfectly okay to ask the recruiter or the HR coordinator. You can just simply ask them, can you tell me who I would be meeting with? And then from there, you can do research on those individuals. So you might look up their bios on their websites, check them out on LinkedIn. That's all appropriate things to be doing. If it's an in-person interview, map out directions first and also understand parking. So I know that sounds like maybe something that's not at the front of your mind, but parking, especially if you are interviewing in a larger city, maybe a space that you're not as familiar with, that can be really important to figure that out. And it's even good if you can go ahead of time. So if you can practice the day before about getting there, that can be helpful. Print copies of your resume. We offer printing at the Career Center, so you can print your resume on resume paper. You can do that at the Career Center. You can print on your own. That can be helpful. And then if you're bringing anything, sometimes students will bring a portfolio, or if there's any requested materials, you want to make sure that you have that organized in advance. If you need to print beforehand, go ahead and do that. Or if you have to submit things virtually, just make sure you have all of those things in order. When we're talking about dress, we have lots of questions about dress. And so I always err on the side of caution. So I typically always say wear a suit, because for an interview, it's better to be overdressed than underdressed. I think that some industries might be a little bit more flexible with what they expect, but I would say you're never going to go wrong with a suit. So it's kind of the same for men and women in terms of wearing a jacket. You can wear pants, you can wear a skirt as long as it's an appropriate length. We talk about wearing maybe tights or nylons. As far as shoes, you want to wear a professional shoe. I tell students, if you're not comfortable wearing heels, don't wear heels that day. Just wear a professional looking shoe, something that you feel really confident in walking in. And we just tell students, just don't wear anything that's distracting, right? So you don't want anything to distract from what you're saying. You want the interviewers to be able to focus on you. Okay, so if you ever have questions about dress, if what's appropriate for an interview, you can always come to the Career Center. I have plenty of students who show me a image on their phone, like, is this okay what I'm wearing? And we're happy to tell you, like, yep, that would be good, or maybe you might want to consider something else. We want you to be comfortable too. So I can't say a suit is always the most comfortable thing to be wearing, but we do want you to feel like we don't want what you're wearing to distract from how you're feeling that day too. I mentioned virtual interviewing earlier, how it's a little bit of a different experience than maybe the in-person and the in-person in the phone interview. So some tips that we have is get fully dressed. I think that will make you feel prepared for the day, but you don't necessarily want to do that tip of, oh, I'm going to wear my suit jacket and then I'm going to have my sweatpants on the bottom. There's that funny commercial where, it shows the person that's half dressed and what can happen in that scenario. So just for your own comfort and to ease any worry that you might have, really recommend getting fully dressed. Find a quiet and cleaned space where you can do your interview. We know that sometimes in college, right, your living quarters might not be ideal for interviewing. So you can reserve a space at the Career Center. I think the library also has spaces. I recommend, and I'm not set up like this currently, just the way my office is, but I actually recommend not having a door behind you, just because a door can open and then you can easily be distracted. I recommend just having a wall behind you, a clean space. You want to make sure that you check your technology beforehand. Check that Zoom link beforehand if that's the case, or they might have you do a different platform. Sometimes with interviewing too, I should say with virtual interviewing, some companies are doing it where you are actually interviewing with somebody. You are just recording yourself. So they will give you a series of questions and then they have some sort of recording system where you will log in and then you're just answering the questions, and it's a time limit, and then you're not getting any feedback from anybody. And you submit that, and that sometimes is like the first round of interviewing. So that can be a little bit awkward too, because per usual, you're not getting any feedback, similar to phone interviewing, you're not getting any facial feedback from anybody else, and then you're just talking to yourself, which can feel a little bit awkward, but that's just kind of a new way that some employers are doing things. This tip I learned just from working with students and when we were kind of in that transitional space during COVID. If you have a MacBook, especially, make sure that you turn off your alerts. So what can happen with a MacBook is your texting might be coming in, you might be sharing your screen, and then all of a sudden your text messages are showing up in your interview. So just make sure to turn off all of those alerts. I know, like, I tried to just close out of my email because sometimes those alerts pop up and it can be pretty distracting. The last thing I would say too is for lighting, choose front lighting versus back lighting. So sometimes you can get a Zoom light. I don't think you always need to invest in those. They are nice, but I would say just try to have the lighting in front of you, because otherwise if it's behind you, you're going to get some shadows. And you might be wondering what's going through the employer mind during this time. And so the employer it is subjective interviewing. So they are kind of assessing different things about you. The most important thing that they're thinking about is your content and the thoughtfulness of your responses. They like to see evidence-based responses. So the reasoning as to why you are responding the way you are, sometimes, especially in scenario-based questions, they're looking at your reasoning and evidence in your response. They are looking at grammar and vocabulary. Really, they're evaluating communication, right? Can you effectively communicate to maybe a group of experts, or it can even be to people that aren't in your discipline, right? Can you take that really complex information and make it digestible to other people? They want to make sure you're listening. So that's really key. When you are responding to a question, you want to make sure that you're answering the question that they asked, which sometimes can be trickier than you might think in an interview, just because the nerves can get the best of you. So even in an interview, you can ask the interviewer to repeat the question if you need. You just want to make sure that you're answering that. Sometimes there is a two-part question. And so if you answer and then you're wondering, oh my gosh, did I answer that? Ask them to repeat the question. That's totally okay. Really what they're hoping for is that you answer the full question. Expressiveness is important. Sometimes we feel like we have to be even more expressive when you are via Zoom. For those of you that are introverts and even extroverts too, but interviewing can be really draining. And so I think just being aware of, after it, you might feel a little bit like that, but it is important that you're showing that you're engaged, that you're listening, even simple things like nodding your head when someone is talking, reiterating the question that they asked just to make sure your understanding shows that you are engaged. It is okay to have some humor, all right? So I know that that might feel a little risky. It's okay to be yourself. I know that sounds cliche. We had a candidate recently who at Grand Valley who used some humor, and it was a great way to get to know them a little bit more. It really made them quite likable and someone that we would have wanted to work with. In-person interviewing, you might have a handshake. I know that that is different times now, just after COVID. That was something we kind of stepped away from for a little bit. And I think handshaking is becoming more the norm again. So what I would say with that is give a firm handshake. And I know this sounds silly, but practice shaking hands with somebody else. I think that it's just something that you have to get comfortable with if you haven't done it before. And then dress, they are evaluating your dress, but like I said, just stick to the traditional suit, I think, and basic kind of neutral colors, black, white, navy, gray, that's pretty common. I don't think it's inappropriate to wear color. I love wearing color. So I think just as long as it's not distracting, that's really what you want to focus on. Okay, so now we're going to jump into questions. And this is always the big concern for everyone, right? So once you get past the prep, then now we're here, I'm sitting with this person or these people, and now I have to answer these questions. And oftentimes students will say, I just am really worried what they're going to ask me. And honestly, we don't know what they're going to ask you. So what we try to do at the Career Center is give you strategies as to how to prepare for what they could ask, right? So we will run through some general questions and types of questions that you might hear. A lot of times there's a lot of similarities with the interview questions, especially kind of in that first screening. But we're going to give you some tips on what to look out for and then how to communicate your skills and experiences. So the first question that is often asked, it's something like, tell me about yourself. They want to know a little bit more about you. They're often wondering like, hey, how did you get to this point? What made you interested in this position? So it might be, tell me about yourself. Tell me why you're interested in this job. Why do you want to work for this organization? And honestly, that's just kind of different ways to answer the same question. So you can have somewhat of a structure to this type of response. So I always tell students to think about past, present, future. So think about what initially made you interested in the industry or the field. What are you currently doing to gain experience? What's been your involvement? And then what are you looking forward to if it's a program, if it's graduate school, if it's the organization or position that you're applying to? What are you looking forward to about working in that role? Right. So past, present, future, I think just gives you a structure. It does not have to be that way. You can answer however you are most comfortable with, but I think that gives you an idea of like, okay, where can I start with this type of response? So when we start to devise this, really what they're looking for is a brief history of who you are in your journey. And if you're not sure where to start, always start with where you're from. That's an easy thing to do. I have found that if you interview outside of Michigan, it's always kind of fun to use your hand, right? So that is a pure Michigan thing. We will point to where we're from on our hand. When I interviewed in Tennessee after grad school, that was like, I guess I started doing it. I said, oh, I'm from Detroit area, it's over here. And it really helped to kind of lighten the mood, right? It was kind of a joke that started people off. And then I found other interviewers, they would say, oh, she's from here, right? And so that was a fun thing. If you're in Michigan, obviously that maybe wouldn't be, or if you're interviewing in Michigan, that might not be as common, but you can definitely start with where you're from. Then you can start with what are you studying and why are you interested in the field? Now, I know that obviously you're studying whatever you're studying because you liked it, but it's good to brainstorm a little bit of the specifics of that, because I think when you are articulating what you like in your head, it might sound one way, but then articulating that out loud and then articulating that out loud to someone else, those are 3 different experiences. So I really recommend brainstorming that. You can write it down, practice it. Interviewing is a skill. Nobody is born with it. So if you're like, oh, I'm not good at this, that's okay. It's something that we all have to practice. I talk about interviewing every day at my job, and if I had to interview tomorrow, I would definitely be practicing too. Then you want to focus on what related experiences you have. Hopefully you want to reflect on some of your experiences from your graduate program. Either you might be doing things specifically in grad school, or maybe you are currently in a job where you're already doing some of this. So you want to reflect on some of your recent experiences, and then why you're interested in the position that you're applying to. Potentially, you could be applying to positions that really align with your area of study, but sometimes you're not. And so even if that's the case, if you are making a shift into another industry or career field, you want to focus on those transferable skills that you have. This question is often kind of the introductory question, so it's okay to kind of just touch on some of those things, and there's probably going to be opportunities later where you can expand on that. So while this question might feel like an easy softball question, it's often a question that's really difficult to answer, just because you might be wondering, well, what do you want to know about me, right? And so that's why I say, go ahead and brainstorm this, write it out, practice it, because it's usually a question that's going to be asked. All right, so just to give you an idea of what you're looking for, I put on my historical cap and thought about how I was framing these questions when I was graduating from grad school. And so just to give you an example, I used myself. So I said, hi, my name is Meghan Veltri. I'm originally from East Point, Michigan. I'm currently a graduate student at Grand Valley State University studying college student affairs leadership. My interest in pursuing a career in higher education stemmed from my undergraduate experience working in the IT department and admissions offices as a student worker. I'm currently working as a graduate assistant in the University Counseling Center, where I'm focused on supporting undecided students in their career development. Through my graduate training, I found a specific interest in using evidence-based practices when working with first-generation college students. My master's project focused on meeting the academic and career needs of first-generation and underserved college students. I'm excited to be interviewing today, as I believe my one-on-one coaching with students, my research, and my experience working collaboratively on first-year student work teams aligns with the Student Academic Success Coordinator position at Macomb Community College. All right, so there gives a little bit that past, present, future. Here is my initial interest in higher education. Here's what I've been doing. And here's why I'm excited to be working at this institution in the future. All right. So the next type of questions that we'll be focusing on is behavioral-based questions. So behavioral-based questions are anytime you hear, tell me about a time when. Can you give me an example of a time when? You'll hear that type of question phrased. And so what they are looking for with behavioral-based questions is they are looking for an evidence-based response. So if you can give a concrete example of a time when you've demonstrated this, that is the best way to support your response. And so when you're answering that type of question, we utilize something called the STAR method. So the STAR method stands for situation, task, action, results, and reflection. The STAR method is nice because I think what students are often worried about with interviewing is rambling. They're really worried about not staying on task or staying focused with their response. But often what I see too is students not giving enough information. So the listener doesn't always understand the story. The STAR method prevents you from rambling and also encourages you to give enough information so the listener has an idea of what the scenario is and understands how you followed through with this task or this project. All right, so you can apply the STAR method, and I'm going to give an example of how you can apply the STAR method to a behavioral-based question. And so I tried to utilize, now I do not necessarily know the scenario, I made this response up, but there was, and actually I think that there's some recent updates on this project, but there was a group at Grand Valley that received a grant. And so they were designing a wheelchair for individuals with special needs. So I love the story that came from Grand Valley's graduate school, and we had a variety of students working on this. And then I was Google searching this because I love this story so much, and I saw that there was a recent update. So the response that I'm giving was actually just something that I made up, but this grant, the university had received a grant from the National Sciences Foundation. So the question might be, tell me about a time when you worked on an interdisciplinary team. Okay, so when you get this type of question, you want to think, okay, your brain might be running really fast. It is okay to say, let me think about that for a moment, or to take some time to think, and you can look down. You don't have to make eye contact during that time if that feels a little bit intimidating. So the response that I identified here or created here. So I said, I pretended to be a PT student. And so I said, in my second year of PT school, I had the opportunity to work on an interdisciplinary team comprised of professors and students from biomedical engineering, psychology, and physical therapy. The university had received a grant from the National Sciences Foundation to create a play and mobility device for children with special needs. In my physical therapy role, I performed and completed the patient evaluations and drafted the needs-based assessments, which would be given to the biomedical engineers. During the testing phase, I collaborated with the psychologists to design treatment plans that would promote cognitive and physical development for patients. The wheelchair is currently in production, and we are now in the process of testing the device to meet the needs of children ages 15 to 18. This experience helped me to hone my technical communication skills and to think creatively, which I think aligns with the values of the research associate role at the Van Andel Institute. So when we're using the STAR method here, the situation was that you're on an interdisciplinary team with biomedical engineering, psychology, and PT students and professors. The task is the task two is that they received this grant, and so that they had to design this mobility device. And so it was the wheelchair. So the action is everything that the PT student had to do. So they did the patient evaluations, they did the need-based assessments, they made the treatment plans. And then the result was that now that they're able to move forward with this wheelchair, now they're testing 15 to 18-year-olds. And then the reflection piece is, okay, what did you learn? How does this relate to the position that you're working with? What might you have changed? So those are all things you can think about in the reflection. So the student talked about how it really helped them to hone their technical communication skills and to think creatively, and that aligns with the research associate position. So the STAR method, I really think is something that you have to practice. It isn't just a Grand Valley thing. Employers utilize this. So we've had some employers that say the way they base their evaluation on interviewers is that they see if they went through the STAR method. So it's not just something cute that we made up at the Career Center. It's actually something that is fundamental with interviewing. So what I tell students to do is to practice that STAR method, even if it's like doing an outline. So if you write out STARR, and then you fill in the blanks. Now, of course, I read this off the screen, right? And so that might feel very structured, but in person, that's where you would have to practice it. So you might have to practice kind of having that outline and then being able to talk through it. So really interviewing, you're not going to be able to read off that script. So that's where you have to practice in order to get comfortable with telling your own story. That's really the key too. We don't know what types of questions that they're going to ask you. So you don't want to memorize questions. What's actually better is if you use the questions as a way to practice telling your own story. That's what you want to get comfortable with, because that's what you know. You know your story and you know your industry that you're looking into. And so then when they throw questions at you, really you're just going to be kind of going through your Rolodex of experiences that you have and then applying those experiences to the questions that they ask. One thing that I tell students they can do is you can still use general interview questions. So maybe it's tell me about a time where you demonstrated communication. Tell me about a time where you worked on a team project. And then if it's tell me about a time that you demonstrated communication, use that question and try to answer it with each bigger example that you have on your resume. So maybe it's in your graduate assistant work, maybe it's in your part-time job that you've had, maybe it's in your previous career, maybe it's volunteering. Think about all those times that you've had to demonstrate communication. Then all of a sudden you're going to have 4 to 5 examples of communication. And then those stories that you have, you might actually be able to apply them to something else. So maybe you could use that story and apply it to a time where you had to navigate conflict, or maybe you can use that story as a time where you had to think critically. All right, so that will just help you to brainstorm different experiences. We often forget what we've been doing, especially in graduate school. You're so busy and you've taken on so much and you kind of forget, like, gosh, I was actually using a lot of skills when I was working on this community-based project or when I was writing my final thesis. So it just helps you to bring those to the surface. All right. I'm going to go over a few other types of questions that you might hear. I would say behavioral-based questions are the most common thing that you might hear in interviews. You might also have questions that are attitudinal-based. So, for example, an attitudinal question might be, what didn't you like about your former employer? So that's a little bit of a tricky question. They are basically assessing to see if you're a negative Nancy. They're looking to see if you are taking responsibility or placing blame on others. And so really what I tell students is, you don't have to go too deep down the rabbit hole. So you can stick to facts. I wouldn't say anything like personality based, but you might just say, you might talk about an issue, but really talk about what was positive about that, what you learned from that experience. You never want to throw anyone under the bus, because what the employer might be thinking is, well, what if you work for us and then you go interview elsewhere? Are you going to throw us under the bus? So you want to be careful with attitudinal questions. A lot of times it might be like, what was an issue that you dealt with your former supervisor? And so just be very mindful, you don't need to overindulge anything. Mostly just stick to what have you learned from these scenarios. Sometimes there is a wild card question. And so part of the reason why employers put in wild card questions can be just to help lighten the mood. Sometimes they're also nervous and they are looking for a little bit of break in the action too. So sometimes it could be something like, if you were a candy, what would you be and why? And really, they're looking to see if you're flexible and adaptable and just go with it. It can be silly. And you can even say, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting that question. Let me think about that for a second. Or, it can be something that sometimes it's more like, hey, what is a recent book that you've read? And why does it relate to this? It just feels really open-ended. I would say just go with it. It's okay if it's not a perfect response, but they're just looking to hear something that's a little bit creative and open-ended. Okay. You might hear scenario questions. These are also very common. So the employer is assessing your ethics and problem solving and critical thinking skills. So you definitely want to align with the ethics of your profession. This can be really common in those multiple mini interviews that we talked about with medical schools too. They will have a lot of ethics-based questions, but they might say something like, a customer approaches you and is upset about that their order is incorrect. How do you respond? Or it might be a client that's upset. And it doesn't always have to be that type of scenario, but what they are looking for is for you to walk through what you would do in that. And it's great if you do have experience in that previously. And so you can always reference something like that. And if it's not the exact perfect experience that aligns, that's okay. But you might say, similarly, here's how I navigated this type of situation, and then align it with the question or the scenario that they gave you. And you can walk them through the steps. They really like to see that, like what your process would be. These questions you can't always prepare for, but again, you'll want to do some brainstorming to think about some of those maybe scenarios, longer term projects that you worked on, and just make sure that you can walk through those steps. And again, the STAR method will help you with that. Oops. Okay. You always want to know why you want this job. I always tell students, think of 2 to 3 concrete reasons as to why you want a job. You might be thinking, I have rent to pay, I would like health insurance, and those are very real things. But I think you definitely want to be communicating with the employer, right? So you want to be speaking the language that they are speaking, and you don't want to make it about you. You want to make it about, like, why do you want to be working for this organization? What opportunities are you excited about for the work and the change and the influence that you could be making? Right. There might be questions that are, I should say, diversity-based, and it's not that there's one diversity question. There could be a lot of them. You really want to have a good understanding of diversity. What does it mean to you? So you want to be able to reflect on that. I would encourage you to really have a thoughtful response or a thoughtful approach to this, to be very mindful of the type of language that you're using. You can use that past, present, future model again. So with diversity can be a lot of things: race, class, gender, sexual orientation, culture, geography, different points of view and perspective. So it can be a lot of things. And sometimes even if it is a diversity question, just kind of identifying what diversity means to you, that's a great start. Think about experiences of when you've worked with someone who is different than you. Just going to graduate school and going to college is a diverse experience. Try to think about the classes that you took that were diversity related. If you can make a connection to things that you learned about in the classroom, and if you saw those outside of the classroom or vice versa, maybe saw it outside and then you really dug into kind of what was the background or foundation of that, or why things are the way they are. That can really be wise to reflect upon. Think about some of those theories that you learned about in your graduate education. That really shows some knowledge if you can do theory to practice as well too. But really what they're looking for is, are you respectful? Can you demonstrate empathy? Do you see why diversity and continued learning is really important? Right. The strengths and weaknesses question, this is really common. So they're assessing self-awareness. I always tell students, you don't need a laundry list of strengths or weaknesses. You just need a couple, and you need to be able to articulate what those strengths or skills are. It doesn't always have to be attributes of you. It can be experiences as well too. So for example, for my healthcare students, maybe a student has worked in a lot of settings. So they might have worked in a hospital, in a nursing home, in a rehab facility. That shows diversity of experience, and that can be a strength or a skill. So really the formula with that is name it, demonstrate it, relate it. So identify what the strength is, demonstrate when you have performed that or showcase that, and then relate it back to the position that you are applying to. Right. And if you need help identifying your strengths, talk to people you know, think about the feedback that you've received in school or in the workplace. Those might be some natural strengths that you have that you don't even realize because you think everybody operates that way, but really it's unique to you. And those can really be authentic. So instead of just picking things that you think the employer needs to hear, really think about what your strengths are and how those could apply. The employer might also ask you, do you have any questions for us? You can prepare those questions in advance. Be sure you can write them on a piece of paper before. You can bring them, well, I should say, bring them in a Padfolio if it's an in-person interview, but you can prepare those ahead of time. If you do your employer research, you can come up with some good questions because you don't want to ask things that are obvious or that you could have found on the website. Write down as many as you can just in case they start answering those in the interview. You don't want to be repeating questions they already answered because it just looks like that you might not be listening. All right, so this is a good place where you can ask questions about company culture too. So you might even ask a question like, what's your lunchtime like? You know, they might say, oh, we all go into our individual spaces, or, oh, we eat together at a table, or maybe it's, you know, once a month we meet somewhere. And so you can kind of get a vibe for what the culture might be like. All right, I'm mindful of the time. So this is, I think we're doing okay because this is our last slide, but just wanted to give you some survival tips. I mentioned some of these before. You can repeat the question. You can take a moment to collect your thoughts. That's okay. You can ask the interviewer to repeat the question. You can paraphrase the question. So a time that I demonstrated initiative was, and so sometimes that just helps you to get your brain on track with what you are verbally processing. It's okay to identify your nervousness. So if you mess up, if you fumble, which you will, you can always just say, you know, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I'm just a little bit nervous, or it's okay. Sometimes people get blotchy. Just say, you know, I'm just nervous, but I'm really excited about this position. And that's why I'm nervous. Some people do get emotional during interviewing. And this is actually maybe common's not the word, but it can happen more than you think. And I think just the magnitude, especially after grad school, right? You have been preparing and sacrificing for a really long time to get where you are. And so they might just ask you a question that just hits right at your heartstrings. If that happens, take a deep breath and you can just say, you know, I'm emotional because I'm so passionate about this, or this has just been a long ride for my family and I, and I'm so happy to be with you today. All right. And oops, I do have one more slide. So I just wanted to tell you there's a couple of resources at Grand Valley that you can utilize. You can utilize our simulated interviews. We have Big Interview, which is a resource that you can access on demand. Then we have our Work Like a Laker podcast, which has a couple of episodes on interviewing. And then we also have our Career Center resources page, which we have a lot of tools about salary information, navigating interview processes. So please feel free to utilize those. All right, Trista, that's all I have.
Awesome. Fabulous. We do not have any questions so far in the chat. And what I'm going to do is actually stop the recording. Sometimes that helps people feel a little bit more comfortable.